Today we'll be discussing the cost of disparity and how state tax policies fuel the racial wealth gap. First, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Kat Harris, an assistant professor in the Department of Accounting here at WSU Pullman. Dr. Harris teaches undergraduate and graduate auditing courses, and her research focuses on audit quality and processes, as well as corporate governance. Most recently, she has published work on gender equity in public accounting, which is kind of what motivated me to invite our keynote speaker, Melissa Hellmann, to present today. Kat, I turn the mic over to you to introduce Melissa.
Thank you, Jeff. It's my pleasure to introduce Melissa Hellmann, who joins us from the Center for Public Integrity, a news organization dedicated to investigating causes of inequity in our country. Melissa is an award-winning journalist specializing in investigating racial, gender, and economic inequality. She has covered underrepresented communities throughout the world for over a decade. From the homes of migrant families in the outskirts of China to Israel checkpoints in the West Bank to communities here in Washington State, she works diligently to expose those responsible for practices that may impact marginalized groups. Prior to joining the Center for Public Integrity in 2021, Melissa worked at the Seattle Times, Seattle Weekly, the Associated Press, Yes Magazine, Time Asia, and SF Weekly. She served as president of the Seattle Association of Black Journalists from 2019 to 2021 and helped to restart the organization after several years of it being dormant. She has also been an independent reporter and editor, developing breaking news features and investigations about national and international social issues, politics, law, health, culture, and education topics. Melissa's global expertise, along with her bachelor's degrees in anthropology and religious studies from the University of Pittsburgh, and a master's degree in journalism from the University of California, Berkeley, positions her to share unique insights regarding disparities in equality and well-being. Please join me in welcoming Melissa Hellmann as our keynote speaker.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining in person and virtually today. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. I just would like to point out that you want to text your questions to that number that's up there, 509-866-6285. And the questions will go to Melissa to answer those questions. But yeah, please send that. I'm sorry to interrupt, Melissa.
That's okay. So thank you all for joining me today. As was mentioned during the introduction, I'm a reporter with the Center for Public Integrity, where I investigate racial, gender, and economic inequality. But my career originally began in China, where I covered underrepresented communities in Shanghai. And I later went on to cover the criminal system, housing, technology, healthcare, and immigration from Kansas, California, and most recently Washington State, where I reported from Seattle for over 5 years. But about a year ago, when I learned that my team at the Center for Public Integrity would be reporting on state taxation, I was overcome with dread. If you're anything like me, the word taxes evokes strong feelings ranging from boredom and frustration to sheer terror. How could I, someone who barely understood their finances and who has gotten an extension on their taxes in previous years, report on taxation? So I'm curious, what are the first words that come to mind for you when you think of taxes? See. Okay, I was going to have you do a survey, but it appears to not be working on my end right now. So we're going to skip that part.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't know why.
Were they supposed to
when I went on to, when I was on my computer previously, it was just working. So I don't know why it's not right now. But it's okay. So we're gonna skip that part. I can at least tell you what the rest of Americans are thinking about when they think about taxes. So just yesterday when I searched for this, some of the first words that came up were taxes are due, taxes are too high, taxes are theft, and taxes are bad. So we often have negative associations with taxes. But as I dug deeper into the topic, I realized that taxation is more fascinating than I could have imagined. Taxes touch virtually every aspect of our lives, from schools, parks, and housing to marriage. The state, down to the neighborhood where you live, and even the color of your skin can determine how much you pay in taxes. A recurring theme in our reporting is that most states, Washington included, takes a greater share of income from the wealthy than poor people. This is called regressive. According to the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, nationwide, the lowest income earners pay a share of state and local taxes 54% higher than top earners. This disproportionately negatively impacts communities of color. And to show you how, I'm going to take a look at racial disparities in taxes from a national perspective. So discriminatory policies throughout American history have led to white Americans owning more wealth than Black Americans. In fact, the median white household is 10 times that of Black households. The 2016 survey of consumer finances showed that the net worth of the median white household is $171,000, while a Black household is $17,100. And while we know that race intersects with every aspect of American life, we've not had very much research to show us that about state taxes until recently. And part of that reason is because the IRS doesn't publish statistics on race. Legal scholar Dorothy Brown discovered this when she set out to investigate the intersection of race and the tax code in her book, The Whiteness of Wealth. When she prepared her parents' taxes, she learned that her parents, a plumber and a nurse, paid a higher tax bill than they would if they were single and filed separately. That's known as a marriage penalty. On the other hand, a marriage bonus is when a couple who files jointly pays less in taxes than they would if they were single. So according to a recent Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center analysis, 46% of Black couples experience marriage penalties compared to 43% of white couples. Meanwhile, only 36% of Black couples experience marriage bonuses compared to 43% of white couples. In her book, Brown explains that the reason for this disparity is because of the joint tax return, which was created in 1948. And this was designed with the heterosexual white couple in mind. Black wives have worked outside the house more than white wives throughout history. Because Black couples made around the same amount, they did not have a difference in wages that helped offset taxes, which leads to a marriage bonus. Racial inequality is also evident in retirement accounts. Black Americans are more likely to withdraw from their retirement account early, regardless of income, because they are more likely to help family members who didn't have as many opportunities. On the other hand, white wealth has traditionally been built across generations. To this day, gifts and inheritance are not taxed. When white college graduates help their families, they do so tax-free, Brown concluded. And meanwhile, Black people, when Black people help their families, it comes at a cost. Studies also show that low-priced properties disproportionately owned by people of color often received inflated property tax assessments. This leads to higher tax bills, which can increase the odds of losing your home. Part of the reason for these disparities is because many tax codes were created during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. To show you that taxes have been designed to exacerbate racial disparities, I'll start from the beginning. So now we'll go through a brief tax history. Discriminatory public policies and practices shaped the origins of US tax code. Following the Civil War, Black politicians set about to redistribute wealth generated by slavery. They used local taxes to fund school systems and to repair and construct infrastructure. As a result, tax rates nearly doubled in the South between 1860 and 1870. The change in tax code was met by violence. White Southerners who resisted the changes were known as redeemers. The redeemers launched a campaign of violence and voter suppression to intimidate Black office holders. In his book, Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, historian Eric Foner wrote, "Through their constant vilification of Blacks, carpetbaggers, scalawags, and Reconstruction, the old political leaders fostered a climate that condoned violence as a legitimate weapon in the struggle for redemption. The intimidation tactics were effective. In a National Bureau of Economic Research paper, economic scholar Trevor Logan found that for each additional dollar in per capita tax revenue collected, the likelihood of violence increased by over 25% in 1870. What followed were the creation of tax policies that favored whites, and some of them are still in effect today. For instance, in 1890, Mississippi adopted a new constitution that required 3/5 majority votes to pass most tax increases. It remains the oldest supermajority requirement that's still in existence today. The Mississippi delegate who introduced the requirement, Mayor Dabney, later wrote that he desired to remove Black influence from the world of politics. Supermajority requirements continue to impact the lives of Black people, making investments in public services and schools difficult. In 1875 and 1901, Alabama adopted constitutional property tax limits that are still on the books. By putting a cap on property taxes, Alabama limited the amount of money collected from white homeowners that funded public services and schools. The first modern sales tax was adopted in Mississippi in 1932 amid the Great Depression. Mississippi Governor Mike Connor advertised the consumer tax at the time as a way to reduce property taxes. The people who benefited from this the most were overwhelmingly white, who were mostly the property owners at the time. Black families who were less likely to own property saw an overall increase in their taxes. The trend caught on, leading states throughout the nation to quickly follow suit. Similar to the rest of the nation, the origins of Washington's state tax code prevented people of color from building wealth. Back in 1864, when Washington was still a territory, the government levied a per head of household tax on Chinese adults that was 3 times higher than the same tax on whites. There was no secret about the intent of this tax. As the title of the act included the words, "to protect free white labor against competition and to discourage the immigration of the Chinese into this territory." It was eventually repealed 5 years later. As Andy Nicholas, the senior fellow at Washington State Budget and Policy Center, told me during my reporting, you can't divorce the impact of tax code from the laws and practices within the state that are racist, sexist, and classist. This graph shows the results of an analysis by a bipartisan group established by the legislature. And it's called the Washington State Tax Structure Work Group. So in 2020, their analysis found that the poorest Washington residents pay 15% of their income in state and local taxes. And meanwhile, the wealthiest just pay 3% of their income in state and local taxes. In my reporting, I spoke with Andy Nicholas from the Washington Budget and Policy Center, who shared with me why he thinks that Washington State's tax system is so regressive. In fact, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy has consistently rated Washington State as having the most regressive tax structure in the country. Nicholas shared with me that in the early 1930s, a group of urban workers and rural farmers in Washington State helped pass a ballot initiative to reduce property taxes and create a personal income tax with rates that increased up the income scale. But the Washington Supreme Court said it violated the state's constitution in 1933. The state's tax system has largely been the same since. To find out what this investment looked like on the ground, I drove to the old lumber town of Aberdeen, the home of grunge band Nirvana. The green Welcome to Aberdeen sign bearing the song lyrics, Come As You Are, an ode to grunge band Nirvana, greeted me off the Olympia Highway. I was there over the summer to speak with locals who were fighting for better paying jobs in timber country. The people I spoke with said that a more equitable tax structure would make their lives easier. Grays Harbor County, where Aberdeen is located, has a poverty rate over 50% higher than the state average. Edith Baltazar has lived in Aberdeen, Washington for nearly 3 decades. She's an organizer of Fireland Workers Action, a nonprofit that supports workers in the farmland and timber country of Western Washington. She told me, my husband is diabetic and we never have enough money because medication costs too much. Last year, her family made the difficult decision to pay for their property tax instead of her husband's medicine. Dina Jansen, Executive Director of Fireland Workers Action, told me we live and breathe the regressive tax system every day through the many different ways we're seeing our communities facing decades of disinvestment. I drove with Baltazar and Jansen around Aberdeen, where I saw houses with peeling paint damaged by annual flooding. They took me to a mobile home park where the road was littered with potholes. Across the nation, states are trying to make tax systems more equitable through refundable tax credits or changing their systems. Washington passed a 7% capital gains tax for profits over $250,000 on assets such as stocks and bonds, with revenue from the tax going toward childcare, which is currently in litigation. Washington's Working Families Tax Credit seeks to address disparities. Low-income people can qualify for tax credits of $300 per individual or up to $1,200 for a family of 4. And legislators in 8 states, Washington, Connecticut, California, Illinois, New York, Maryland, Minnesota, and Hawaii introduced bills or announced plans to increase taxes on the wealthy last month. We can also look to other states for guidance. In Massachusetts, voters approved a 9% income tax for millionaires last fall. Phineas Baxendale, policy director of nonprofit think tank Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center, told me that it took 10 years of advocacy efforts to pass the surtax on Massachusetts' 26,200 millionaires. The state did so by amending the state constitution. Especially with the split Congress, states can't wait for the feds to be their knight in shining armor. Baxendale told me they need to take action themselves. And we finished a little bit earlier since I wasn't able to do that survey. So I think we have some extra time for questions.
Can you tell us what's in the survey questions? Because we can text them in.
Sure. So I wanted people to type in what were some thoughts that they had about state taxation. So I'll just ask you all, what are some of the first words that come to mind when you think of taxes?
So you can speak them out here, but it doesn't work as well for the at-home audience, and there's a fair amount there. But the where's that number again? Oh, shoot. 509-866-6285 is the text number that you can send that in. And what specifically you're looking for is?
So I'm curious about what are some of the first words that come to mind when people think of state taxes?
Okay, so one is taxes are complicated. And I've heard that there's 2 of them. And another one comes up, too regressive, but I wonder if that was planted. Burdensome. I wonder if that's burdensome is burdensome from the standpoint of money or burdensome from the standpoint of compliance, that is doing the tax returns. That 729-2978 could clarify that. Yeah. What other words come up for your thoughts when you think of taxes? Um, I might ask, why do you like not having an income tax in the state of Washington?
Awesome.
Another one that comes up is scary. Other things people like is or say is no income tax in Washington. That's something that is kind of almost a brand name for Washington.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yes. I can't do my cell phone, I can't.
Okay.
You know, the most progressive states, I would say off the top of my head, California, New York, Massachusetts, and specifically California and New York. The wealthy people, because it's so progressive, are going to the states, i.e. Florida, Texas, that primarily rely on property taxes and sales tax, which admittedly are regressive, have a regressive system. So what's your solution to that? You can, great, they've increased the rates, but wealthier people are leaving those states. What's your thoughts on that?
I have seen some research that's shown that people aren't leaving as often as that argument says. So I personally have not seen research that's backed that people are leaving in droves.
I'm not in droves, but they are leaving. I mean, it's
Property taxes.
there's a net migration from New York and California, and I've seen studies that show the wealthiest people, those that are leaving and going to Florida is the go-to state, but also Texas. Both of whom have no income tax.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Jeff?
Well, I mean, Elon Musk is the most famous example, right? Who moved from California to Texas, and I know it happens. I know that it would be an unfortunate thing for the Department of Revenue, Washington Department of Revenue, if to chase away Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, who kind of are the goose that lays the golden eggs for some of us. So even though they're only paying the 3% or less, probably less, because they're so massively wealthy, that number that they pay is still a large number and helps to do things like this room. You know, those things that are, it's not a very super easy thing.
You know what, could you imagine a property tax on, could you imagine how much property tax that, Bill Gates would have on his, I think they say it's worth over $100 million, just his property, his house. So, I mean, if you lose somebody like that, it just, state of Washington does have one of the highest, if not the highest, estate tax provisions. So I don't know how many are actually hit with that, but we do have an estate tax that somewhat mitigates the regressive nature of the state of Washington.
Mhm.
So, yeah, we don't want to lose Jeff Bezos and, yeah.
I think that the person behind him had a question. Did you?
I have a question, sure.
Yeah, here you go. Because we have such an online audience, please, and identify yourself, please.
I'm Logan. Just have like a question when it comes to like lack of understanding. That's what I put when you asked the question, like what people think about taxes. So I don't know, but if I didn't go to high school in Washington, I'm from Colorado, but I didn't have any tax classes. So with the income gap and all that stuff that you talked about, and with like minorities not just being able to afford college as much, like, do you think there should be education in like K-12, something like that?
So I know that there are some states around the country that are putting these financial classes in schools. So I know that in New Jersey, I think that in middle schools, there's now a requirement for financial education. So I know that is becoming more popular throughout the country. But I agree. I also don't know, and I'm in my 30s. It's taken trial and error for me to figure these things out.
So we are one of only 6 states in the United States that does not have an income tax. And I think it would be interesting to just see a show of hands. How many people would like to have an income tax? Big raise, yeah, right. But the thing is that the reason we have this regressivity in our taxes is we have a sales tax and we have a tax on the sale that's taxed on the seller as well as on the buyer. So you don't actually see that one. It's called the business and occupation tax. And then we also have property taxes, which empirical evidence shows that landlords just pass those on to tenants. I mean, that is pretty well documented. And so if you're a tenant, you end up paying those property taxes. Those are some of the reasons that our tax system is regressive, is because we cannot do a graduated progressive tax system with those other, with sales taxes, with payroll tax, with property tax. It's not been done before anyway. I think there's a movement to do a progressive property tax in the state of Washington now. Other questions? Did you have some more questions you wanted to ask on your platform that you were using?
So I'm curious if anyone else was aware of the racist history of taxes. Is that something that anyone has ever heard about or learned before? I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
So the question is, if people have heard that tax systems are racist, has anybody heard that the American tax system has sort of some racial undertones? Can you tell us a little bit more about a couple of ways that's?
I'll be more than happy to share.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for.
Can you identify yourself?
Yeah, of course. Hi, I'm Sophia. So I am someone who's looking to study public policy and public administration. And so one of the things that I've noticed, and I'm not originally from Washington State, I'm from North Carolina. And so when you were bringing up Brookings Institute, they did a study that showed and demonstrated the wealth gap, specifically when it came down to socially economically amongst those who were people of color, and then those who were the majority, or those who identified as white or Caucasian. So one of the things that we noticed, and even in North Carolina, was redlining, which was something that those who benefited from living within a particular zip code, of course, was affected by, of course, their property and the property taxes, and then those who lived within those areas, or whoever were more so kept out of living within those areas, could not gain wealth or a certain amount of wealth because they were kept out of those areas because of redlining. So I know that some of the studies that you've done in regards to just looking at how taxes are the disparity of wealth, and how regressive taxes kept individuals who identified as people of color from gaining wealth. I wonder, within that intersection of redlining and then of course taxes, how much more so were you able to identify other inequitable practices that other states, and not couldn't potentially maybe Washington State, but I know again I know a little bit more about North Carolina within that region. Like, have you seen within that intersectionality of things like redlining, taxes, or within that socioeconomic disparity, have you seen a little bit more disparity within that equity of wealth?
So are you asking me about the connection between taxes and redlining?
Correct, or other inequitable practices like redlining, for instance. Have you seen other practices that have caused, I guess, an additional impact on those who are people of color, that have impacted people of color from, again, gaining wealth or having access to wealth?
Right. Yeah. So we've seen that in property taxes. We've seen that Black homeowners, that their houses, and they often were having houses that were being assessed at a higher rate, although that inflation wasn't necessarily warranted, and because of that, it made the property taxes be higher, and then that could result in people losing their homes. And then also, I mentioned in the presentation about the 3/5 majority rule. And so we've seen that in a few states. And so that basically says that there needs to be 3/5 of the legislature that says that that agrees to changes in taxes for those taxes to be changed. And that has really made it difficult for anything related to public services or schools for tax changes related to that to be passed.
I would also say that Washington policymakers have been addressing this. They've been doing it in starting right now. We have the Working Families Tax Credit, which is a refundable tax credit for families. It's at $300 per person if you are really at the bottom end of the income scale, and a maximum of, I believe, $1,200 per family. And the Department of Revenue, their biggest problem is getting people to file for it and getting them, because you see a letter from the Department of Revenue, most people don't want to open it. And the problem is that they really are trying to send you a check for $300 for each person in the household. At the high end, we have a very controversial tax. It's called the long-term capital gains tax that's actually being decided by the Supreme Court of Washington as we speak. And it has a number of pretty severe flaws, but the idea is to impose a tax on the very wealthy. For example, a $250,000 annual exemption. For most of us, that kind of takes care of business.
And that tax is designed to go towards childcare and other public services.
I have some questions from online.
Okay.
So, most millionaires and the 1% that are being targeted aren't income earning, but instead asset earning. How do you propose to target the individuals who actually you actually want to target, because income tax will not really affect those individuals? They already have wealth.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, I think that there are so many different loopholes within the tax system that do allow the wealthy to be able to get away without paying their fair share of taxes.
So there are some proposals for wealth taxes in the United States, and even in the State House in Washington.
Yeah.
It's difficult. It's a difficult tax.
Yeah, and there are, as I mentioned in my presentation, there are 8 states that are trying to pass these wealth taxes, and it's that could include estate taxes. That could also include taxes on unrealized and realized capital gains. So that means that if you end up cashing in on your stocks, that would be taxed. So there are some solutions from different states. And then there are also places like Massachusetts that are actually trying to change their constitution. They had something on their books called the Uniformity Clause, which is also in the Washington State Constitution, and that basically says that all people need to be taxed uniformly. And that has prevented us from having a more progressive income tax, which is an income tax that would be graduated. And so that is the same issue in Massachusetts. They also have this uniformity clause, and their Supreme Court had consistently ruled that this uniformity clause meant that they couldn't have a more progressive income tax. So they actually passed a ballot measure so that they were able to make an amendment to their constitution so that they could change it and then be able to add about a 4% tax on the millionaires there.
Why does the IRS not track taxes as related to race when so many other functions of American life are tracked in regards to race, and we are regularly required to disclose our race on other official forms? I'm not sure about that requirement part. Do you think that this is a way for the IRS to protect themselves from criticism about how different races are taxed?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think that for a long time we have just thought that the color of money is green, and that there's no way that there can be racial disparities in it. But I think that research from Brown and other legal scholars have shown us that there are actually these racial disparities in our tax code.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I just had one question. Just for some background, I actually got off from work filing taxes right before I got here. So, but I was curious if you think that it should be left to the states on the decision on how to tax individuals when the federal tax code applies to all individuals, and oftentimes I feel like benefits low-income earners more than higher earners.
Yeah, so we have seen in our the Center for Public Integrity has seen in our series that the federal tax structure is much more progressive than basically every state. And so, so your question was, sorry, could you?
But yeah, just whether or not it should be up to the states and the individuals in those states to decide how they're going to tax the residents, opposed to like the federal government, who already taxes all citizens and non-citizens as well.
Right. So I think that especially with our current split Congress, that it's going to be very difficult to see any like really progressive changes in the tax structure anytime soon. And so for that reason, I think that I have seen states taking the matter into their own hands. So we've seen at least 10 states this year propose some changes in their legislature to try to tax the wealthy or have more progressive tax structure.
Okay, I have another one. It's not a question of that things need to change, but I'm only one person. I both work and go to school full time, but which greatly limits my time and resources. What is the single most impactful thing I can do to help the situation?
I think it's always so hard when asked about what an individual can do, because so often it's the bills and it's the legislators who have the power in these instances. But I think that with tax structure, just as with any social issue that you're interested in, you can contact your legislators. You can also get involved with work groups or any organizations that are in your area that look at taxes. Do you have any comments on that?
I would just say that Michelle Chapman with the Amplifier program, and when you go on Suitable and you want to complete that, then you have a chance. She's going to take those comments that you have and distill them into a letter to the chairs of the House Finance Committee and the Senate Ways and Means Committee. So yeah, by being in this class, you have an opportunity to inform them about how you, the future of Washington, feel about these issues. So that's one thing that the Amplifier program is set up to, and doing for this. However you feel about it, and by the way, it's going right by me. I'm not involved.
Hi, I'm so
Hold on a second. And by the way, you can text to that number too if you'd like. And if you want to speak, that's no problem.
Yep. Hi, I'm Soho. This reminded me of a project I did a few years ago where I thought I would just be focusing on hopelessness. I don't know if this is on. But I ended up uncovering this whole web of like, you can't just address homelessness. You have to look at like prison reform, like job training, even childcare accessibility. So do you think this tax issue is similar in that sense, where there are like all these underlying, I guess, non-tax issues that you need to address first, and things like tax credits or tax reform is just kind of like a band-aid on it? Or would you say that addressing the tax structure is kind of like a big thing, I guess, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that there are so many different things that intersect with taxes, but in terms of looking at things like public funding for schools and looking at things like access to healthcare or childcare, having a more equitable tax system could better fund those things that could address these root problems, such as the criminal justice system and other things that we see in society.
Okay, I have one from online, a real easy one for you.
Okay.
How do we keep the wealthy from using their influence in politics to advantage themselves?
Yeah, how to answer that one. So we've seen a lot of the same organizations are behind a lot of these bills throughout the nation to try to cut taxes for the wealthy. And so we've seen their influence in funding, and then we've also seen it in lobbying. And so I think probably the only way is just to make what they're doing known, to have investigations on it, to let them know that they're not working in the darkness.
Alicia?
Hi, my name's Alicia. My question is, what do you think can be done to address how taxes are viewed? Because we've seen just from the discussion so far, from your screenshot, that a lot of people think that taxes are bad. And I, before becoming an accounting student, I would have agreed. And I was lucky enough to be able to take a class where it was a discussion on how taxes can benefit all of us. And that's really opened my eyes and changed my views. But I'm lucky enough that I had the opportunity to do that. Not everyone has that opportunity. What do you think are ways that we can help educate others that may not have those opportunities right now?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think having more opportunities such as you had, I think also showing the impact of taxes on the ground, because people can say things like, oh, having equitable funding for schools is a good thing, having equal access to healthcare is a good thing, but when it comes to what it takes to get there, it might be a little bit more difficult to convince people. And also, just in my research for this presentation, I've seen that there's been a campaign throughout US history, that has really maligned taxes. And it really started with the Reconstruction period. And it was because former slave owners didn't want to pay higher taxes, or to have the wealth that was created by slavery to be equally distributed to Black people. And so for that reason, the Redeemers launched a campaign, and the Redeemers were white Southerners who opposed changes to the tax code in the late 1800s. So they launched campaigns, and they went around to different conventions and conferences over decades, and basically talked about how taxes were terrible. So you've really seen this throughout US history. So I think that we maybe need to do like a re-education of history, or a re-education of taxes, show the ways that taxes show up in our everyday lives, and contribute to the things that we actually want.
Other questions? Instead of worrying as much about wealthy people leaving states, shouldn't we be worried about helping people in need and fixing mistakes that negatively affected people of color and poor people? I think that's part of your message, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that would be nice.
Yeah.
That's not up to me, though.
Mm-hmm. And I actually believe that sentiment is is shared by some pretty influential people in the Washington halls of the State House. So it's not unique. There was, and especially in the city of Seattle, there is that sense that the people from Amazon, for example, and when Amazon left, this is back to what Professor Toulson was saying earlier, an example of leaving a state. Amazon relocated a second headquarters, in part because they didn't feel welcome in Seattle. And that was in part because of taxes. And there are people in the city council in Seattle that say, good riddance, right? That's how they feel. So that is an issue that we need to think about, at least, and wrap your heads around. It's not an easy one. Other thoughts you want to share?
I think that you phrased it very well.
Okay. All right. Well, I would just like to say thank you very much, Melissa, for making this long trip out to the Palouse and getting us to think about taxes and wealth and race. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.